on the trail of the national security state long before most people thought it was anything more than a conspiracy theory, as we now say. Who do you think is actually in charge of the government at this point?
So Glenn Greenwald and Tucker Carlson were having a conversation about the deep state. And I'm not gonna lie to you, this one is a little bit stickier to pick apart to break down what the reality is. Because we need to understand something. Of course, there is a deep state in the sense that there are government officials who are in their positions before and after presidencies, and that not every single person in the government is entirely replaced whenever we elect a new president. It is also true that the government officials who are in these positions largely report to Congress, which is a very important detail because you see the president of the United States is responsible for executing the law as it is, and the executive branch and all of its agencies are there to serve that purpose. Now, the core misunderstanding here that Glenn Greenwald has, and you'll see this in a second, is that he seems to think that these professional government officials shouldn't be following the law that Congress has established, but instead should be operating at the sole discretion of the president.
Days before Trump was inaugurated, when he had posted something criticizing the CIA for getting Iraq wrong, and Chuck Schumer said, ethics aside, how can Donald Trump be so stupid as to do that to the CIA? If you challenge the CIA, they have 6 different ways to Sunday to get back at you.
Now, this part is to a certain degree correct. The CIA does have a long history of subverting presidencies to a certain degree, like, of course, when the CIA had planned out the Bay of Pigs and then presented it to John F. Kennedy and sort of pressured John F. Kennedy to give approval. But the Bay of Pigs is also a demonstrative example because when Allen Dulles went to JFK to ask for an air invasion of Cuba, JFK said no. And there wasn't an air invasion of Cuba, and the Bay of Pigs was allowed to fail. Donald Trump saying that the CIA got it wrong is to a certain extent true about the Iraq War. But we also need to understand this. It was not the official position of the entire CIA that Iraq had chemical weapons. It was the position of one sub-agency that was specifically oriented towards chemical weapons. They used the testimony of one witness that later proved to be uncredible to make that claim. That claim was then funneled up to President Bush in order to pressure him to go into the Iraq War and was used as justification for the Iraq War. And even then, that example is telling, and it's very important because it wasn't the entire agency of the CIA. It was one specific subunit. Based on the history of the CIA, this is how these things tend to operate anyway. The work that could be seen as being more political or outside the norms of what you would expect, especially when it comes to fabricating evidence to try and bully a president into starting a war, those things are typically not done within the main body of the CIA itself, but are done within subunits that have a specific mission and focus, where it's easier for ideologues to have positions of power.
And the entire Trump presidency was driven by all sorts of narratives from the media about how these heroic independent generals like Mattis and John Kelly and H.R. McMaster were going to save us from the elected president. And there were all kinds of reports about how these security state officials would conceal classified information that they didn't want President Trump to have in order to manipulate his decision-making or even subvert or ignore his decision-making, like when he would tell them to withdraw troops from Syria and they would lie to him and pretend they did when they just moved them instead.
See, with this, we need to understand something. You see, war is declared by Congress, and that's very, very important, especially when you consider that the president is the one that has administrative control over the military. The president is only supposed to be using the military in ways that Congress approves of. Now, I personally disagree with essentially every approval that the military has had, but what is being misunderstood here is that it is for Congress to decide where exactly that goes. When these elected officials were expressing hope that these generals would follow the law as it is, they were simply stating the hope that democratic norms would maintain under the Trump presidency. A perfect example of this is the internal reports that recently came out about Donald Trump trying to plan some sort of ridiculous scheme to maintain himself as the president. Cabinet officials and government officials laughed at that idea and they said no, because of course they did. Because once again, Congress pays their paychecks. And just because the president has administrative authority during their term doesn't mean they have carte blanche to do whatever they want with these institutions.
They would tell you that you were crazy, like you were a conspiracy theory, even as they were cheering for the classic definition of the deep state in the first place. So you have to be a conspiracy theorist or incredibly gullible not to believe that that exists.
And this is the thing. It's not a conspiracy theory to say that these government officials wanted to listen to Congress and cared about democratic norms and respected the constitutional structure of the way that the United States is today. It's also telling when you look at the examples that they don't mention. When you look at the Department of Homeland Security, that was designed in its origin to be far more shielded from congressional oversight, you see instances like the extreme abuses that accelerated under Donald Trump. Because the Department of Homeland Security, specifically ICE and Customs and Border Patrol, have far less congressional oversight and far less structure in place for there to be those checks and balances. Donald Trump was more than capable of enacting an extremely racist border policy, one that Joe Biden, unfortunately, has yet to undo. When Donald Trump arbitrarily defined how people should seek asylum, which was breaking international law, to be clear, Congress had little means to stop him. In fact, many in Congress simply refused to acknowledge that Trump's new asylum policy was even a violation of international law, which once again, it is. But when it comes to something like the military, there's a long history of deep congressional oversight, and there's many checks and balances that are put into place. I mean, seriously, the United States Constitution says that we're not even supposed to have a standing army, and that's why the army has to be reauthorized every 2 years, otherwise it will cease to exist. If they don't pass the National Defense Authorization Act at least once every 2 years, literally, the army is disbanded and loses funding. It's simply an older institution that has more built-in controls, not something like the Department of Homeland Security that was built under the Bush administration largely to exist outside of judicial and congressional oversight. And what oversight there has been minimal at best.
And this was celebrated while at the same time they would say, if you say that there's a deep state in the United States, which is nothing more than what Dwight Eisenhower warned about, a permanent power faction in Washington that rules the country regardless of the outcome of election.
So here's the evidence that won me over. Famously, people say if you want to know who's really in charge, who you're not allowed to criticize. Republicans and Democrats never criticize the national security state. I mean, Republicans are happy to go after the IRS or the Education Department. I can't remember the last time a Republican leader meaningfully criticized DOJ or the Pentagon, and of course, Democrats are exactly the same.
And this is the final half-truth that they present. It is true that Democrats are very rarely critical of the military-industrial complex. But that's not because of some sort of grand conspiracy. That's because of what we already know is that the United States has an extreme amount of money in politics. And of course, defense contractors have huge influence in Washington, D.C. So the reason you're seeing this deep state be very unified with Congress and most Democrats in Congress and most Republicans, to be clear, is because the military generals work with the defense contractors on a regular basis, and they have working relationships. And those defense contractors also have working relationships with these people in Congress. And it turns out there's this monetary interest coming from the military-industrial complex to keep war going. That is why you don't see many Democrats or Republicans criticizing United States foreign policy, and why you see Democrats continue to increase the military budget. But it's not because there's some sort of secret deep state working behind the scenes. It's just because Democrats love defense contractors just as much as the Republicans do. So what they're telling you is this deep state to undermine Trump is just the standard politics of the military-industrial complex trying to make a profit off of the United States war machine. I'm Ben Carollo with Rebel Headquarters. You can catch my show Galaxy Brain every Friday in the Young Turks Twitch channel at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. You can follow me on Twitter if you want to stay up to date with my content.